Okay, I think we're live. Good afternoon, everybody from Kiel, and welcome to the third live Q&A of the ongoing massive open online course, One Planet, One Ocean. My name is Enno. I'm going to be the OceanMooc Scout moderating today's session, and I have two experts from around the world with us, Levin and Kristina Gjerde, who I'm really happy that they could join us. The thing works like this. You can ask questions, basically typing them into the live chat, which is on the right hand side of the YouTube video, and I will be forwarding them to our two experts. But before we start diving into the questions, I would like to give Kristina and Lisa the opportunity to briefly introduce themselves to our audience. So Lisa, why don't you start telling us a bit about your recent work, about your field of expertise and research interests?
Sure. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in Southern California, USA. And my area of research is effectively the ecology of the ocean, in particular the plants and animals, mainly animals, on the sea floor. Most recently, I've been spending my time studying the deep ocean, the ecology and changing environment of the deep ocean, and within the last few years, focusing in particular on conservation and stewardship of this realm. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Kristina, why don't you go?
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I am the Senior High Seas Advisor to IUCN, where I've been involved since 2002, focused largely on trying to help encourage conservation, sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. I'm a lawyer by training, but sometimes feel far removed from the actual practice of law. But what I try to do is to better apply existing laws and policies to enhance conservation, sustainable use of marine biodiversity everywhere, but with a specific focus these days on the high seas and the deep seabed area. I'm also an adjunct professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Law in Monterey, California, and involved with Lisa in the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, amongst other things.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody, keep in mind that you can ask your questions on the right-hand side of the live chat. I'm going to start with you, Kristina. A question that is coming up in the forum of the OceanMooc on a regular basis is concerning marine protected areas and the ways to actually enforce them, to prevent them from being paper parks, basically. What do you think is necessary to actually have them enforced?
Okay, well, I'm not a technology expert, but I think there is great hope these days with the advancements in technology that allow us to have a better eye on the sea, if you will. There's initiatives like Eyes on the Sea or the Global Fisheries Watch that are able to translate existing sort of vessel emissions into algorithms that actually can tell us who the vessel is, what activity they're engaging in, and where they've been and where they're going. I think this sort of information, when it escapes from just simply the hold of the person who's in charge of the ship, can really help to let us know who is doing what, where on the high seas. And if we can share that information with fisheries enforcement authorities or national authorities and ports, we can really start to get a handle on how to ensure people are cooperating with high seas marine protected areas. Does that make sense?
Well, to me it makes sense, yes. But to follow up on that, once you realize that somebody or someone is not really for example, fishing in a no-take zone, what are the legal instruments to then do something against this or put a fine on it or something like this?
Well, the Law of the Sea Convention envisages some form of port state enforcement. And this idea of port state enforcement has recently been elaborated in the so-called Port State Measures Agreement, which actually requires states to either inspect vessels when they come into their ports, or actually say, if you cannot document where your fish are from, we do not have to accept you into our port. This, of course, takes capacity building for port authorities in developing countries, develop the law and legal system, but it's perfectly legal to instill requirements for entry into your ports, even if the activity is going on in the high seas, and even to not admit a vessel into your ports if they don't comply with those legal requirements, including for conservation.
Thank you, Kristina. Lisa, yeah, go ahead, Lisa, sorry.
Sure, just to comment on that, I forget if the question included MPAs that were also within national jurisdictions. I think another important aspect to enforcement is the social buy-in of the community. I think that you will get a lot more reporting and effective enforcement if the entire community, including the fishing communities in the area, understand the importance of the MPA, have seen the benefits themselves, and can help make them effective. And that often happens.
And if I can just elaborate there with respect to areas beyond national jurisdiction, we of course want to get the fishing industry engaged and educated and aware of the true extent of impact that fishing can have on the open ocean, pelagic and deep sea environments. There's just recently been an article by, I can never pronounce the whole name, Guillermo Ortuño Crespo and Daniel Dunn on the ecosystem effects of open ocean fisheries. And I'm hoping everybody will read that. Daniel Dunn, D-U-N-N, is a key name to remember. And I'm hopeful that by working with these sort of industries, that they can start to understand why we need to start setting some areas off limits, either to all fishing or to some fishing, or at least to some form of fishing gear. Because it is having very dramatic impacts and will have more dramatic impacts into the future.
Okay. Does any one of you know any good practice examples from around the world where MPAs are enforced and are actually working?
Cabo Pulmo in Mexico is an excellent example. It was a very degraded coral habitat in the Gulf of California, and it's really been turned around with the buy-in of the fishing community, more tourism and other uses. And
I'd say
and it's recovered.
That's in Africa. There's the I Watch Africa that is trying to help the states better enforce at least their fisheries legislation. And I think it's important to remember that when governments adopt laws, it's not automatically assumed that 100% will comply. If they did, we would never adopt a fisheries law. We somehow seem to have a higher standard for a marine protected area than we do for a fisheries regulatory measure. And so I think we need to think that if we adopt a reasonable law, that there will be, at least as they say with MPA enforcement, 70 to 80% will comply, but you need to build a framework that will show that you're capable of enforcing the law, and that helps to induce the rogue few, to help comply as well.
Yeah. Most of the time when talking about MPAs, people think about restricting or regulating fisheries. Expanding that to the deep sea, are there MPAs that specifically focus on deep sea ecosystems and regulate, for example, deep sea mining, etc.?
Lisa, you want to go first?
Sure. There are a number of different types of protections for the deep sea. In the case of seabed mining, which has not yet taken place, there is a responsibility that the International Seabed Authority has to protect the marine environment. Kristina can elaborate on that, but it has led to the formation of APEIs, area of particular environmental concern, which are no mining areas that are set aside in the general vicinity of the regions being considered for mining. So these exist now in the Clarion-Clipperton Fracture Zone in the abyss off Mexico in the Eastern Pacific. And there is discussion of APEIs in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and other areas being considered for mining. So that's one category. The FAO has identified vulnerable marine ecosystems that are set aside, and bottom trawling is not allowed there. Again, Kristina probably knows more of those details. And those are for the seafloor. Kristina, you want to talk about EBSAs and other types of potential protections?
Okay, well, I'll go back to the vulnerable marine ecosystems. The United Nations General Assembly, in fact, adopted a series of resolutions, first in 2006, that said that regional fisheries management organizations and states had a responsibility to protect biodiversity in the marine environment and to prevent significant adverse impacts on that biodiversity. As a result, the FAO developed these guidelines for international fisheries in the deep sea, and part of that actually lays out what is a vulnerable marine ecosystem, how do you conduct an environmental impact assessment for deep sea fisheries, and what constitutes a significant adverse impact. To simplify things, many states and RFMOs have just simply said, we're not going to bother to fish in this relatively large area. So there are now a series of closed areas to deep sea bottom contact gear only, called vulnerable marine ecosystems. And the FAO has a webpage that actually lists where these VMEs are. There could be many more. That's what they don't do is protect species that are in the water column. They don't protect from depletion. They don't protect sort of the little creatures that live in the water, or they don't protect things that are downstream from the water. So it's a very limited tool, even with respect to deep sea bottom fisheries. The International Seabed Authority has, as Lisa said, designated these systems of areas of particular environmental interest. And what's exciting about that is it shows that you can establish a representative network of no mining areas, or in the future marine protected areas, even if you know very little about what is actually out there. IUCN has had guidelines since 1980s, basically talking about the importance of protecting representative areas as well as the sort of special and unique places. And on the special side of the equation, the Convention Biological Diversity has designed these criteria for ecologically or biologically significant areas. So they're so-called EBSAs. And those are just a tool to guide, so far, a series of regional workshops to describe areas that are more significant than others in a region. So the Sargasso Sea stands out as an EBSA. Its seamounts in the Sargasso Sea have been closed to deep sea bottom contact fishing by the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization. But that's about the only protective measure that has so far come into place, and it's from a different organization.
Thank you very much, Kristina and Lisa. Just to our viewers out there, be reminded that you are able to ask questions, type them in, and I'm going to be forwarding them to our experts today. This is your unique opportunity to ask a pressuring question to Kristina or Lisa. As part of the OceanMooc, we have an interview with some students here from Kiel who participated in the 2016 Young Economics Summit. And what they proposed as an idea was a concept of rotating marine protected areas in the North Sea. So basically a limited number of MPAs that would rotate every 5-6 years. Maybe Kristina, what do you think of such an idea? Would that be something that is actually able to be implemented or reasonable from an ecological point of view, Lisa? Kristina, go ahead.
Okay, well, it's an admirable idea, and I think it has a role and value, but I'm not sure it could be described as a marine protected area. there are real guidelines and criteria for what is an MPA and what is not. And an MPA is supposed to be established for long-term protection of an ecosystem and its associated ecosystem services and cultural values. That's the IUCN definition. So an area that would be closed or managed for, say, 5 years, and then you open that to fishing, and then you close another area, may be a very useful tool for fisheries management to allow some recovery in a specific area. But unless you have a management plan, unless you have long-term protections in place, I'm not sure I would really call it a marine protected area. I'll stop there.
Lisa, you want to follow up on that?
Sure. I think my first thought was this sounds like a fisheries management tool. It probably is aimed at fisheries, including some species that grow fast enough to recover within 5 years of closure. But I think one would need to know much more about the habitats being protected and the response times, the resilience of these habitats, if there is disturbance or removal of key critical species, how long it takes those species to recover, the structure of the habitat to recover. So 5 or 6 years might work for some very rapidly growing shallow water ecosystems. It definitely wouldn't be effective for most of the deep sea ecosystems that I know about. But yeah, presumably that idea would be based as a management tool on knowledge of the timescales on which those ecosystems recover.
Yeah, it's a useful tool, but it's just, I wouldn't think it would qualify as a marine protected area.
Okay, yeah, I think the initial idea was to create more acceptance with stakeholders, with fishermen, because they don't basically experience closed areas in their front yard, but they can shift from every year or like within 5 years. So, well, nevertheless, I actually like the idea, and I think it's nice to discuss it with you experts on whether this is actually implementable in the end. Lisa, you talked about longer time frames in deep sea ecology, and that we probably had to consider longer generation times, etc. What would you say is or are the main challenges marine deep sea ecosystems are facing today, and what parts do we, or where do we need to reduce anthropogenic impact on them?
Oh, well, that's a great question. There are many challenges. Some of them are much more obvious than others. We've already mentioned seabed mining, which hasn't actually happened yet, but the things that are happening in the deep sea already include bottom trawling and fishing in general, deep water fishing. We're fishing deeper and deeper. Bottom trawling is incredibly destructive and removes the three-dimensional habitats created by corals, sponges, and other deep sea organisms. And my understanding is that about 20% of our margins or more have already been trawled. It's very easy to see that damage when one is actually down making submersible dives in those habitats. Oil and gas drilling has gotten deeper and deeper, and it's now routine to drill below 3,000 meters. And we know that the deeper you go, the riskier this is of a blowout or an accident. And the Deepwater Horizon event that occurred in the Gulf of Mexico is a very real example of that. And we're just starting now to learn about the follow-on damage to not just the deep sea ecosystems, but to the pelagic system and the coastal habitats as well. So oil and gas is a threat. Those are some of the main types of extraction that can cause large-scale damage, but we're not just interested in taking things out of the ocean, we're putting things into the ocean as well. And we know now that there are contaminants that have reached pretty much the deepest part of the ocean, the Mariana Trench, man-made organic contaminants that have accumulated there in the organisms at high levels. We know that there's plastic throughout the ocean. You hear a lot about the great garbage patches in the in the mid-ocean gyres, but there are also a lot of very small pieces of plastic, nurdles and others, that have now made their way throughout the ecosystem. Almost all deep sea samples have some plastics. They're getting into the food web. They're tiny. They're ingested by animals. The big stuff's ingested by seabirds and animals like that, but the very small particles, we're just starting to learn about the ecotoxicological effects of those plastics. So, and then those are sort of the more obvious things. And then we have climate change, which is a much less direct effect of human emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, but it also is affecting the deep ocean. And we're finding that the deep ocean is warming, takes up a huge amount of heat. 93% of our excess heat has gone into the ocean, and a substantial fraction of that has ended up in deep water. It's taking up carbon dioxide, and this is making the ocean more acidic, and this is also affecting deep water. We used to think it would take hundreds of years for these effects to go from the surface ocean into the deep ocean, but now we know through thermohaline circulation and ocean mixing that ocean acidification is getting down there right away into hundreds of meters water depth. It affects deep water coral reefs and potentially many, many other organisms. And then oxygen loss is another follow-on climate change effect of ocean warming. It's the result of changes in water solubility with warmer temperatures and increased stratification. And many areas of the ocean are losing oxygen, including some of the areas that are already very low and could be tipped over thresholds that would no longer support most life. So these are all deep ocean changes that are the result of human activity. And I'll stop there, but there's more.
And I think just to pick up where Lisa left on, what Lisa's been finding and many others, including the UN's report, the first integrated global ocean assessment, that it's the cumulative and synergistic impact of all of these activities and stressors coming at the same time that is really the most urgent concern, is that we're used to dealing with one threat, one species at a time. And as one of the sessions in the MOOC have described, is that we need to rapidly expand our capacity to deal with multiple drivers, multiple stressors, multiple species, communities, and ecosystems. And over time, if we're really going to get a handle on how do you manage an ocean sustainably, or at least manage human impacts so that they lighten their footprint on the ocean, because the ocean is becoming more vulnerable to any stressor as we speak.
Thanks, Kristina. Kristina, you've been working with census scientists to establish the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative. And when talking about the deep sea, we often face the statement that we know less about the deep sea than we know about the dark side of the moon. I personally think that there is a danger to that, because we might be destroying deep sea ecosystems that we hardly know, and we might be losing biodiversity that can actually provide us with services in the future that we don't even know yet. What is your idea of biodiversity in the deep sea ocean, and what can we do to preserve that or to conserve it for future generations?
Well, this is a question for both of us, but I think, yeah, the first thing would be, in order to conserve the biodiversity into the future, is to lighten our overarching footprints, to reduce our demands on the ocean, and to reduce the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that we are emitting. There's two bodies that are taking up this challenge of sort of seabed biodiversity and the water column above. One is the International Seabed Authority, which is charged with developing rules and regulation to administer seabed mining. And part of that obligation is to ensure effective protection of the marine environment. If you're going to ensure effective protection from harmful effects, you need to know, what do we mean by effective protection and what do we mean by harmful effects? The harmful effects are those that are disrupting ecosystem services, structure, and functions. But how do these comport also with the additive or the additional stressors from climate change? And then there's the UN working, well, now it's the Preparatory Committee on Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, where next week we start the 4th of hopefully 4 preparatory committee meetings that's supposed to be coming up with recommendations for what a new treaty for conservation, sustainable use of marine biodiversity should contain. And that's very exciting. Both processes are quite exciting and very important to watch, because we're trying to implement the wise words of the Sustainable Development Goal 14 and all the rest in areas where there is no single government, no single nation has control, and you have to work on a cooperative basis with everyone.
Thank you, Kristina. Lisa, do you want to follow up on that?
I could give you just a few examples of what you described very eloquently, which is that we face loss of biodiversity now before we've actually discovered it or discovered the importance of what's down there. And, you know, this rate of discovery is very rapid. We have more and more access, but we have still not seen most of the deep ocean. So just from my own experiences, one example, about 10 years ago, I was on a research cruise off New Zealand, on a New Zealand vessel, the Tangaroa, and we were exploring their margin for methane seeps, which are chemosynthetic ecosystems that support an amazing array of different types of animals that rely on chemical energy rather than photosynthetic energy. And although there was a sense from the fishermen who brought up little bits of pieces of animals that they probably were down there, New Zealand had never seen them, you know, had never located or seen the located them or seen the organisms. And we found 9 of them on this cruise, and every single one of them had been subject to trawl damage. And when we went back and looked at New Zealand's fishing records, and they keep immaculate records of all their trawl events, we found that every single seep site had been trawled. One of those sites had been trawled 200 times. This means that, and almost all the species present there were new, undiscovered, undescribed species. It means that they'd been really damaged extensively before we even discovered them. And I feel like this type of event has played out over and over again on our margins, you know, that we are really damaging things before we discover and describe them. And then in terms of really not really knowing all of the services that we are getting from the deep ocean, I think another great example is the recent discovery of nursery grounds that we never expected. So for example, methane seeps, which I study, have been found to be nursery grounds for cat sharks, for example, different kinds of sharks, skates, and rays, so elasmobranchs. They'll lay huge numbers of egg cases there. Nobody knows exactly why, because the adults don't actually live there very much, but there must be something either evolutionarily that's linking them to these sulfidic environments, or maybe protection. But at any rate, I think methane seeps, which are increasingly in danger from oil and gas activities because they're often associated with gas hydrates and oil drilling, it's one reason for protecting these systems that we never understood. Increasingly, we're finding out off California that some of our deep water commercial fish species hang out there. So that's a new function. We're discovering that octocorals and sea pens, different kinds of cnidarians have attached fish larvae, attached fish eggs, and the larvae often hang out in their stinging tentacles for protection. So all of these different kinds of ecosystems that we just sort of thought were interesting curiosity, we understand them as hosting a lot of biodiversity, but my point is that we don't actually know all the functions of that biodiversity yet. And we may not know until it's too late if we continue to degrade those ecosystems.
That point... Oh.
Go ahead, Kristina, sorry.
I was just going to... That point from Lisa is critically important in terms of losing things before we know what they do or who they are. This was in large part what drove scientists and non-governmental organizations and eventually states to push for this United Nations General Assembly resolution in 2006, because since the 1960s, the Soviet Union and others had been bottom trawling throughout the Northeast Atlantic, then into the Southeast Pacific, into the around Australia, and then into the Indian Ocean. And it was just sort of clear-cutting both the fish and the mass, anything that protrudes along the way. And we had scientists like Larry Maiden from Woods Hole, is that talking about the tragedy of losing things before you've actually studied them, let alone understood what they did. And for that reason, many organizations called for a moratorium or an interim prohibition on deep sea bottom trawling. That wasn't what the United Nations adopted. Instead, they said that states and RFMO should adopt rules within 2 years to better regulate deep sea bottom trawling to prevent significant adverse impacts. And if it had not been for the United Nations General Assembly stepping in, we would not have gotten even this, relatively, I won't say small, but even this amount of progress going through. And so it really takes a lot of vigilance from scientists, from students, from lawyers, from professionals of all walks to make sure that these activities do not spread into areas that we know so little about before we have a chance to study them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kristina. One issue with the deep sea is that I think myself and probably quite a few of our viewers, or almost all of our viewers, have never had the chance to experience it, to see it. They basically know it from pictures and videos, maybe. It's usually way easier to create engagement and activities around something that you can touch, that you can experience, that you can feel. So, for example, coral reefs, where lots and lots of people are diving and snorkeling, and they're really experiencing it. Can any one of you think of ideas how to create more engagement in deep sea ecology and conservation of deep sea areas?
Shall I take this? Start?
Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry.
I would say there is kind of a revolution, a technology revolution that is bringing the deep sea onto people's computers, into their homes. We call this telepresence. There are now a number of ships that are able to beam live feed of deep sea imagery, LUVIs, basically made by remotely operated vehicles that are tethered to the ship, that are down on the bottom of the ocean. There are several of these run by NOAA and the Ocean Exploration Trust, but I've even seen my own institution, Scripps Institution of Oceanography. One of our new ships is outfitted with more bandwidth and the capability of doing this. And I think this is a trend. Having participated in one of the Nautilus cruises, I was able to see people all over the world, anybody, children, anybody, who had a computer and access to the internet was able to watch the deep ocean, type in and ask questions about it. It's really a very, you're absolutely right that people only care about what they know about, and they'll only protect what they know and love. And unless we can bring the deep sea closer to people, we're not going to have a buy-in for protecting that ocean. So despite the fact that it's half the planet. So I think telepresence is certainly one step in that direction. And for all of the viewers who are actually interested in how to participate in those things, I think we can make the links available to you, and you can make them available online.
Yeah, we will make sure that they appear in the forum.
I think that's hugely important, because my sort of conversion to the deep ocean occurred only when I realized that there were gorgeous coral reefs growing in the deep and cold waters just even off of Norway, as well as in areas of the black hole of the high seas. And that these supported fish, they supported colorful anemones and all this sorts of things. So if you already like coral reefs, it's not a huge leap to understand that the deep ocean also provides vital space for more deep-loving, non-photosynthetic coral reefs to grow too, and sponge beds the size of Manhattan, these antique glass sponges. So if you're curious, the deep ocean is filled with so many amazing and idiosyncratic creatures that have eyes in the top of their transparent foreheads, that have the angles that are bioluminescent. But yeah, in order to see it, I still would love to get out in the submersible. Hint, hint, Lisa. But telepresence is at least a satisfactory stopgap measure.
Thank you very much. We're about half an hour in our live session, and I would like to remind again the viewers to use this opportunity and ask questions. I will be happy to forward them to Kristina and Lisa. Lisa, you're leading the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. Could you explain our audience a bit what this initiative is doing and what your goals are?
Sure. Well, I'm one of 4 leads. Kristina is one of the others, and Maria Baker and Elba Escobar also. And this is a group of people. It's now it's an international virtual network of people who have interest and expertise in the deep ocean. And it includes natural scientists, including many biologists, but also law and policy experts, economists, industry people, regulators, basically anybody who has an interest in the management of the deep ocean. And this group came together to provide guidance on environmental management of the deep ocean, recognizing that there was a lot of human activity that had begun to occur without proper concern for the environment and without regulations in place. So what this group does now looks across the whole spectrum of activities and issues arising in the deep ocean and tries to provide guidance. It's not an advocacy group exactly. It really is about providing best scientific and social scientific expert guidance. So we have 11 working groups. Those working groups address topics like minerals mining, deep ocean fishing. There's a working group on climate change. There's a working group on genetic resources. There's an oil and gas working group. There is a technology group, one that makes an effort to make sure that the deep sea is represented in different world ocean assessments, like the UN World Ocean Assessment. There's a communications group, and Kristina, what have I left off? There's maybe a few others.
The tailings, deep sea tailings placement?
Oh yes, there's a mine tailings placement from land that happens in the deep sea. There's a whole group that focuses on that and its impacts. And the groups really, they come together as basically just interested people and try to provide policy briefs, write articles, bring together expert knowledge, and they have the ability to provide information for people in capacity building. That's the group I forgot. And
that's one of the more important ones.
The most important function of Deepsea is to provide expertise and guidance to people, especially in developing countries where a lot of deep ocean activity may be beginning, but they don't already have the either environmental law expertise or the biological expertise in place. And this is one way that people can get rather immediate feedback, input, literature, and whatever else they need. Do you want to elaborate on that, Kristina? What did I leave off?
Just communications. That was, and education. That was, we actually have quite an extensive list of webinars and lectures that are available online on the dosieproject.org. I think one thing that came up recently is a woman wrote to the head of the oil and gas working group saying that we have plans, a big company wants to come into our deep offshore waters for oil and gas exploitation, and we've never encountered anything like this. The site is actually far away, but still close to where our fishers go. What can you tell us? How can you advise us? What should we be looking for? And so the scientists in Deepsea are saying, send us your environmental impact assessment, and we'll take a look at that, making sure that it's public, and in some cases they can help to look at the laws. At least this is what we would like to be able to do. It is, of course, our own capacity constrained, but that is the intention of really being able to help people who can't otherwise have access to this information.
And we encourage everybody to go online. It's www.dosi, DOSI-project.org, And as Kristina said, there's a huge amount of resources in there. If you look on, there's a talking textbook that's associated with also with Indeep. There's several webinar series with lots and lots of different talks about the deep sea and an amazing array of literature and more.
Thank you. One of the assignments, and at the same time one of the highly discussed issues in our MOOC so far, is the Ocean Health Index, and especially one of the goals, which is tourism and recreation. I was wondering whether you think that it is actually possible to create something like ecotourism that will work at the same time for the environment and securing income for regions in the world where tourism is often the only source of income, or one of the major sources of income. Lisa, do you want to say something to that? Sorry, do you think that it's actually possible to combine tourism and protection of ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, for example?
Definitely. In coastal ecosystems, I think it's not only possible, I think it's a must. In many cases, I think we want to try to convert those who have livelihoods that are very destructive to the marine environment to livelihoods that help protect the marine environment. And well-managed tourism can be extremely beneficial, both economically and environmentally.
I would just put the emphasis on well-managed tourism. And I think that's part of the problem today, and why we're concerned even about ecotourism, because anything, if it's too many people, poorly planned, poorly managed, is no longer sustainable. And so, hearkening back to the Sustainable Development Goals, you really need to make sure that your tourism per se is not causing adverse impacts, and that ecotourism, if it's allowed to go on in, say, marine protected areas, is kept within strict limits that are compatible with the objectives of the protected area. You need sewage treatment, you need waste management, you need all of these things. It's not just keeping the fins off the reef.
Does either of you know, again, a good practice example for working ecotourism?
Well, I think Cabo Polmo is an example where the fishermen livelihoods many of them were diverted into the tourism industry, and that it has allowed the system to recover, the damaged system. Okay.
I'm going to turn to the OceanMooc forum because there were some questions coming up. For example, by Martin Bowl, who is asking, considering the ambition to move from single species, single driver, short time to multiple species, multiple driver, long time with experimental means, is there any theoretical concept that federates the upscaling? Lisa, I would guess this is for you.
I'm not sure I completely understand that question, but you know, the challenge of moving from single species management to ecosystem-based management is a goal that seems to be of interest to many different organizations. And I feel like I am not a theoretical ecologist. I know that there is certainly a lot of case to be made for why we have to manage as whole ecosystems, including the environment, the non-living environment part of it. So I think most people are actually convinced that that needs to be done, but how it actually happens is very, very difficult. I've watched the US fisheries, NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service, which manages their fisheries very effectively, try to move from single species to ecosystem-based management with concepts such as essential fish habitat and so on. We're looking at the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, and the Deepsea giving lip service to ecosystem-based management, but acknowledging that all their baseline regulations are still really single species focused. So I think one of the things that has to happen is that we need better understanding of indicators and thresholds that are going to be effective at sustaining whole ecosystems and not single species. And this is certainly a challenge that faces scientists and managers and regulators right now. But I can't speak to the theoretical underpinnings as well. Okay.
And just on the more on the ground is, I think what we're seeing is that, you know, fisheries management organizations will have their fisheries experts, and they are being seriously challenged. In the case of deep sea bottom fisheries, they had to bring on the expertise in deep sea corals and sponges, and yet they still don't have expertise in deep sea sharks. There are limits probably to what the sectoral organizations can do in terms of dealing with this growing body of scientific information. They need to be doing their job well, but what I'm hoping things like the new implementing agreement for ABNJ can do is to help provide more coordinated international marine scientific research that can start to tackle these theoretical and very real questions of how do you have ecosystem-based management? How do you understand the interaction between fisheries impacts and potential mining impacts and plumes and climate change at the same time? It's beyond the capacity of any one organization to do alone. So we need more joined up research that's trying to answer these questions, that's in addition to and complementary to the responsibility of the scientific experts advising, say, the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Organization. And just to put in a plug for the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission's, IOC's, proposal to start another international decade of ocean exploration for sustainable development. I see it as a very useful counterpart to the SDGs and the goals for 2030, because we truly need to have enhanced scientific understanding and sort of social economic understanding of what's going on in our relations with the ocean and with the ocean itself. And you know, we saw in the MOOC, the mesocosm experiments out in the middle of the open ocean. That does nobody any good if the research only goes to a German scientific agency. It needs to be shared. We need open access. We need facilitated access and exchange and education all around the globe.
Let me put in a plug for one more group that is addressing these issues. The Deep Ocean Observing Strategy is part of the Global Ocean Observing System, GOOSE, and it's also within the IOC. And this is an effort to bring together deep ocean observation networks, of which there are quite a few different ones that mostly aren't talking to each other. But the goal of ecosystem-based management is going to require a wide variety of different types of environmental observations, but biological, biogeochemical, and physical. And one of the goals of the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy is to bring those together and make them available to the whole world, essentially, open access.
We have a live question coming up, and I hope I at least slightly pronounced the name right. Chevly Bishwas asked to Kristina, what would be the adverse effect of deep sea mining? Kristina.
Well, I'll say you ask experts like Lisa Levin to describe that. I could go on for hours, but it's better coming from a scientist.
Sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Okay.
Adverse impacts of seabed mining.
Yeah, the direct footprint of mining is basically complete destruction of the seafloor. And since we understand that at least some of those ecosystems that are being targeted have generation times of hundreds or thousands of years, the organisms, and since we have some experiments that show no recovery after more than a quarter century, even of the bacteria, we know that we're looking at permanent loss of biodiversity and loss of the other functions in the mining footprint. Beyond the direct footprint, there will be effects of suspended sediments and released contaminants from the seabed, and we know very little about those effects. They'll affect other seafloor organisms that are more distant from the mining site, but they'll also affect the entire water column and the mesopelagic food web, part of which will lead to our commercial fisheries. And we really don't know yet the impacts, but we do know that mining is proposed for some areas where there are almost no suspended sediments naturally. For example, the manganese nodule sites, the polymetallic nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone. So it's very likely that having suspended sediment plumes that might last decades or hundreds of years could affect the water column ecosystem as well. I think one of the problems with mining, then there are other effects of noise, light, surface operations, contaminants, oil spills, you know, different types of follow-on activities. But a lot more research really needs to be done before we can not only say what the impacts exactly will be, but look at ways that they might be remediated or prevented.
Okay. Kristina, anything to add to that, or?
Well, I would just say that from a legal perspective, the international seabed beyond national boundaries belongs to humankind. This is under the law of the Sea Convention. That they said it's common heritage of mankind, can't be owned by any one state. No state can make a claim to a part of the seabed unless they go through the International Seabed Authority. The International Seabed Authority is charged with operating on behalf of all humankind. And so I'm hoping questions about, you know, where, what, and how much damage is permitted from seabed mining are raised by the public. We are the humankind as a whole. That there is also a provision in the law of the Sea Convention that is to enable benefit sharing from the economic and other proceeds of seabed mining. So developing countries, and many are excited about this as a short-term source of new money. And yes, it can be a very attractive source of new money. But at the same time, how long is that money going to last? What is it competing with? Where is it going to go? We need to be asking serious questions about this payment regime. And many have said that the most significant benefit that has been shared with all of humankind to date has been the marine scientific research. Because under the law of the Sea Convention, it also says that marine scientific research in the deep seabed should be shared with all of humankind. So we need, I think, a much larger discussion on sort of what it is that we are getting ourselves into that will be very difficult to extract ourselves from.
And just can I come back to the beginning of this session where we're talking about what we don't know and the services we don't know. I mean, one of the big dangers, of course, for mining very large areas of seafloor is the loss of services and functions down there that we haven't discovered yet, and therefore don't know to protect.
We're already coming to an end of our today's live session. I would end it with a personal question to the both of you. The need to act on a global scale in order to protect our ocean is getting more and more attention globally. Yet most of the news are often really negative about degrading ecosystem services, lost ecosystems, and the challenges and issues of conserving and preserving them. What gives you hope that we as humankind are actually able to conserve the ecosystem services, to have future generations experience the ocean in a way we know it and not to lose the benefits from it? Lisa, maybe you want to start.
Yeah, I think, you know, I would love to see raised education and awareness of the importance of the ocean and the realization for people that all the consumption we do has real effects. The reason we're interested in mining and oil and gas from the deep ocean has to do with growing population and the increasing demand for resources, right? Raw materials, energy, food. That's why we're fishing down there. So I think changing people's behaviors, more recycling, more things that we can do to reduce that demand is going to ultimately have an impact on the ocean. And I think making the link in people's mind between understanding what's down there and what there is to protect and ways their behavior can have an effect would be very important going forward.
Lisa said it beautifully. I would just condense it all to know before you go. And learn more about what you're doing. I think local initiatives, getting more contact with the nearest body of water, whether it's a stream, a brook, or a seaside, is also very important in trying to get that level of immersive education and understanding of the importance of water on this very planet, and the interrelations and interconnections of one tiny island state to what's going on in, say, Germany or India. And what gives me hope is we have seen so much change and so much awareness. For example, on ocean plastics, that this was a new issue, say, 5 years ago. I was on a vessel and I got my little piece of glass on a rope, and people were saying, oh, have you heard about this ocean plastics problem? And for many of us, it was new. And now it's, you know, subject to bans on plastic bags. But we have to go further than that. We have to go deeper than that. We have to start addressing the drivers of ecosystem damage and stressors on land, as well as really try to enhance our understanding of what's going on throughout our planetary system before we really start causing irreversible harm. And teaching people, like through this course, how important that is, and that we're not magicians who can just snap our fingers and repair everything, I think is a vital lesson to take to hand.
Beautiful said. Thank you very much, Kristina. Thank you, Lisa, for your time, for joining us today. I really liked our little discussion here. To our audience, I'd like to say, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the OceanMooc forum. We'll be able to forward them to Lisa and Kristina. We will do our best to get them answered to you. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in, and see you again.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.